The crisp snap of Froot Loops hitting cold milk is a sensory memory etched into the minds of millions of Americans. An iconic sound that immediately conjures images of vibrant, saturated colors swirling in the white liquid. Yet, for a child growing up along the serene, breathtaking fjords of Norway, this specific palette of artificial neon brilliance is conspicuously absent from the breakfast table. A deliberate and firm exclusion rooted in a profound and irreconcilable difference in national food safety philosophy. The colorful loops found in grocery stores across Bergen or Oslo are consistently a pale, muted imitation of their American cousins, stripped entirely of the synthetic agents that give them their infamous, signature neon glow, standing as a silent and powerful testament to a regulatory chasm separating two wealthy continents. This profound divergence is more than just a subtle matter of cosmetic preference or a logistical issue of ingredient sourcing. It represents a fundamental, philosophical disagreement over the acceptable risk to public health, specifically the long-term health of developing children. The focal point of this entire, protracted controversy is a single molecule known commercially in the United States as red dye 40, but scientifically and globally labeled as Ellure red AC, or the European code E129. This seemingly innocuous additive, synthesized ultimately from crude petroleum, is the chemical core of the red dye scandal, the specific substance that Norway and its Nordic neighbors decided was simply too risky to permit, while the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the powerful FDA, stands firmly by its continued, unconditional legality. The alarming story begins deep within the intricate chemical structure of this specific azo dye, a broad class of synthetic colorants historically derived from coal tar or, more commonly and cheaply today, refined petroleum. Ellure Red AC was first introduced into the market in the 1970s as an official replacement for the previously banned red dye No. 2, or amaranth, which had been finally linked to cancer risks in animal studies, starkly showcasing a recurring and unsettling historical pattern of replacing one problematic synthetic with another equally questionable substitute. Its exceptional stability, remarkably low cost of production, and its ability to consistently produce a dazzling, lasting red hue made it an instant favorite for global manufacturers, transforming it into a crucial and cheap tool for manipulating consumer perception, making processed foods appear misleadingly sweeter, fresher, and far more appealing than their naturally duller and uncolored counterparts. This sheer chemical brilliance and commercial utility, however, comes tethered to a concerning and growing dossier of potential health issues. The very scientific documents that initially fueled the resolute European regulatory opposition. The most widely cited and debated concern revolves around the dye's neurobehavioral effects, particularly its suspected link to increased hyperactivity and the exacerbation of attention deficit issues in genetically sensitive children. Landmark studies, such as the famous 2007 Southampton study conducted in the United Kingdom, provided significant, though not universally conclusive, evidence suggesting that a dietary mixture of several artificial food colors, including red 40 and the preservative sodium benzoate, could indeed measurably exacerbate hyperactive behavior in certain cohorts of young children. While the European Food Safety Authority (EFSA) later re-evaluated the comprehensive data and did not find sufficient absolute evidence to justify a complete ban for the entire European Union, the findings triggered an immediate and permanent shift in EU food policy across the continent. Instead of an outright prohibition on red 40, a powerful and legally binding mandate was issued: any food product containing this specific dye, along with 5 other synthetic colorants, must henceforth carry a conspicuously placed label warning consumers that the additive may have an adverse effect on activity and attention in children. This mandatory warning label alone was enough to create a highly effective functional ban, as virtually no major food company wanted their primary children's cereal or snack product to carry such a conspicuous, reputation-damaging scarlet letter on its box in the European marketplace. Norway, which skillfully maintains a unique position outside the full EU membership but aligns closely with European trade and safety standards, through the European Economic Area Agreement, chose to take an even stricter, more definitive, and uncompromising stance, relying heavily on the foundational precautionary principle. This powerful regulatory philosophy dictates that if there is a reasonable, scientifically plausible suspicion of harm to public health or the environment, even without absolute, definitive scientific proof of causation, immediate and rigorous preventative action must be taken without delay. For the highly cautious Norwegian Food Safety Authority, the accumulating body of evidence linking red 40, along with its colorful cousins yellow 5 tartrazine and yellow 6 sunset yellow, 2 measurable behavioral issues in children, was deemed sufficient justification to absolutely outlaw their use entirely in consumer food products like Froot Loops, ensuring that its citizens, especially its young citizens, ensuring that it's singing with sinets, ensuring by its expression and sesha, especially in session and expression spence and sense and sense and sense and sense and sen, but in sense and but and pense and sense and sand and component and sessen and wapulacent and consicut with isai sick percentsic osaba wa sack up was so mess born misapor as scaffold if anyone of this no would not be unwilling participants in a slow-moving, long-term toxicological experiment. The American standard, upheld and enforced by the powerful FDA, operates under a distinctly different and often more industry-friendly paradigm. A chemical substance is considered fundamentally safe and permitted until definitive, overwhelming, and legally irrefutable proof of widespread harm is presented to the federal government. The FDA reviewed the exact same body of international evidence, including the pivotal and controversial Southampton study, but officially concluded that the link between the dyes and behavioral problems was not universally strong or conclusive enough to warrant a sweeping national ban for the general population. They conceded that a small, hypersensitive subset of children might indeed be adversely affected, but felt that a broad, national ban was economically unnecessary and disproportionate, thereby prioritizing and protecting the vast economic interests of manufacturers who rely heavily on these cheap, visually potent colorants for market dominance. This crucial and foundational difference in regulatory philosophy creates a jarring, almost unbelievable reality for the global consumer. The exact same highly processed product, Froot Loops, manufactured by the same multinational behemoth, Kellogg's, must be produced using two entirely different and mutually exclusive ingredient lists for these two distinct global markets. In the United States, the intense, almost unbelievably vibrant colors are achieved using a powerful chemical cocktail of synthetic petroleum derivatives, explicitly listing red 40, yellow 5 tartrazine, blue 1, and yellow 6 on the ingredient panel. The Norwegian version, however, meticulously designed to meet their stringent no-dye standard, replaces these entire controversial category of chemicals with natural alternatives, relying instead on food-grade colorants like rich paprika extract, concentrated beetroot juice, and bright turmeric. The resulting sensory experience and visual difference between the two products is not just a negligible cosmetic alteration. It is a profound contrast between the aggressively artificial and the gently natural. The American Froot Loops burst with an almost confrontational intensity, an aggressive visual statement that screams of a highly synthetic experience and an artificially induced sweetness, maximizing impulsive market appeal. Conversely, the European and Norwegian formulations offer a significantly duller, softer, and earthier appearance, a visual cue that aligns more closely with their actual, plant-based origins and natural ingredients. This stark and powerful visual disparity highlights the tremendous and manipulative power of modern food science to actively influence and control consumer desire and expectation, a power fully exploited by marketing strategists who know color sells. Furthermore, the significant public health controversy surrounding Red 40 has extended dramatically beyond the well-known and often debated hyperactivity concerns. More recent and increasingly alarming independent research, often overshadowed by the behavioral studies, has specifically focused on the dye's potential and insidious long-term impact on the delicate balance of the human gut microbiome and on deep cellular health. Published studies on various animal models, including mice, have alarmingly suggested that chronic, consistent exposure to Ellure Red AC, especially when combined with a typical Western high-fat and processed diet, can induce persistent low-grade colonic inflammation and even demonstrably cause significant, measurable DNA damage in the intestinal tract's epithelial lining. The disturbing implication that a common, cheerfully marketed staple of the American breakfast table, heavily advertised and directly sold to children, could be quietly contributing to silence the long-term gut dysfunction or even increasing susceptibility to conditions like inflammatory bowel disease is a profound and deeply unsettling indictment of the FDA's current, permissive regulatory posture. If a known synthetic chemical compound, derived from crude petroleum, demonstrates clear and reproducible evidence of genotoxicity, the proven ability to damage genetic material, and potentially initiate tumor growth in controlled laboratory settings, the Norwegian and European impulse remains to minimize public exposure immediately, strictly adhering to the fundamental precautionary stance that saves lives and prevents disease decades later. The persistent U.S. regulatory response, however, remains one of slow, incremental, and highly cautious observation, consistently maintaining that the trace amounts consumed in typical human diets are simply too low to be statistically or clinically relevant. This conclusion, while carefully framed in scientific terms, does little to assuage the deep anxiety of concerned parents and independent health advocates who worry about the cumulative cocktail effect of multiple dyes and additives. It reinforces a perception that the federal regulatory environment fundamentally favors a calculated acceptance of long-term risk, allowing the massive food industry to maintain a cost-effective, visually appealing product without ever having to bear the significant expense and supply chain complexity of switching to healthier, natural colorants. This pervasive and unacceptable dual standard in global food safety also generates massive confusion and fosters a dangerous, false sense of security for millions of trusting consumers who correctly assume that a product legally sold and approved nationally must be fundamentally and completely harmless. When an American traveler or foreign resident discovers that the brightly colored snack or cereal they consume without a second thought is completely and unequivocally banned in a highly developed, progressive, and modern nation like Norway, it forces a jarring, immediate confrontation with the stark reality of differing national priorities and ethical choices. It powerfully underscores the critical distinction that legal does not automatically or inherently translate to safe, and that the public health standards set by the FDA are in too many critical areas demonstrably less protective than those implemented by their peer nations across the world. The complex and often opaque web of political and economic currents that maintains this unacceptable status quo in the United States often revolves around the immense and deeply entrenched lobbying power wielded by the industrial food sector and its chemical suppliers. Changing an established, long-approved food additive classification requires years of intensive scientific review and faces a well-funded, deeply entrenched corporate opposition that views any new ban as an unacceptable increase in operational cost, a logistical nightmare, and a direct erosion of market freedom. This sheer institutional and political inertia makes it extraordinarily difficult for the FDA to successfully reverse a long-standing approval, even in the face of rapidly accumulating and consistent scientific concern from international bodies, independent research institutions, and its own internal advisory committees. Contrast this deeply entrenched federal resistance with the recent, dynamic, and encouraging legislative movements that have rapidly emerged at the state level across the United States. Movements which reflect a growing public and political impatience with the excessively slow, deliberate, and cautious pace of federal regulation. Major influential states like California have recently taken the significant, unprecedented step of successfully passing legislation specifically banning or phasing out several common controversial food additives, including the notorious red dye No.3 and subsequently targeting the very dyes that make Froot Loops and similar products so aggressively colorful. These bold local actions, which frequently cite the gold standard European standards as their primary justification, represent a crucial and much-needed new front in the protracted war for food safety and purity. These state-level bans demonstrate a clear and decisive willingness to prioritize the collective public health and the absolute protection of consumers over the short-term cost of regulatory harmonization with the currently permissive federal standard. This regional, market-driven pressure is beginning to force the massive food industry to reluctantly reformulate their high-profile products for these large, commercially influential regional markets, a significant development that may eventually create the necessary momentum to force change at the national level. The voluntary decision by Kellogg's and scores of other multinational food corporations to voluntarily and successfully reformulate their high-profile products for the demanding health-conscious European and Scandinavian markets serves as irrefutable, commercial proof that functional alternatives are both technologically viable and entirely scalable for mass industrial production. They demonstrably possess all the necessary technology, the sophisticated logistical knowledge, and the established global supply chains required to produce a safe version of Froot Loops, colored exclusively by concentrated extracts and natural pigments rather than cheap petroleum derivatives. Yet they consciously choose not to implement this safer, marginally more expensive formula universally across the vast American market. This strategic, profit-driven choice highlights a clear corporate calculus. Why incur the extra cost, complexity, and logistical hurdle for a massive captive market, the U.S., that does not legally require the change, especially when decades of aggressive marketing have successfully conditioned American consumers to overwhelmingly expect and prefer the aggressively artificial, neon-bright colors they grew up with. The red dye scandal, when examined through this crucial global lens, is consequently not just about a single, nostalgic breakfast cereal or one specific, isolated chemical compound. It functions as a profound, ethical, and essential lesson in the often opaque world of global food, geopolitics, and corporate responsibility. It starkly exposes a two-tiered system where the vibrant, alluring sheen of a sugary, ultra-processed treat acts as a deceptive mask, successfully hiding the true, controversial ingredients and the wildly disparate levels of consumer health protection afforded across various national borders. In Norway, the state consciously and proactively acts as an ethical gatekeeper, effectively shielding its population from known potential, long-term health risks that the U.S. market accepts. In contrast, within the American regulatory system, the primary and unforgiving burden of responsibility is placed almost entirely upon the individual consumer, who is expected to diligently read and interpret complex labels, decipher the arcane chemical jargon, like E129, and independently assume the potential risk for themselves and their children. This intellectual and logistical burden is often far too heavy, too complex, and too easily missed in the chaotic supermarket environment for the average, trusting shopper. The vibrant, sweet, almost intoxicating aroma of the banned cereal, if one could somehow smell the vast regulatory contrast, would be the complex scent of two very different worlds, two distinct philosophical approaches to public health, and two fundamentally different sets of governmental priorities, all meticulously encapsulated in one colorful, controversial little loop. To fully and accurately grasp the sheer magnitude of this systemic issue, one must consider the staggering annual volume of these specific synthetic dyes consumed by the American population. Millions of pounds of Red 40 alone are poured into the American food supply system every single year, coloring and saturating virtually every food category, from powdered drink mixes and high-sugar sports beverages to countless snack foods and even common over-the-counter medications. This widespread, pervasive, and often unavoidable exposure means that the potential adverse effects, even if statistically minor on an individual per-serving basis, represent an enormous, unquantified, and silent public health burden across the entire population, contributing cumulatively and invisibly to a host of chronic issues that inevitably strain national healthcare systems. The underlying debate also significantly touches upon the crucial ethical responsibilities of modern food marketing, especially when heavily targeting children. The deliberate use of intensely bright, highly concentrated, and completely non-nutritive colors is fundamentally designed with one single commercial goal: to aggressively deceive the visual perception, making low-value, nutritionally void food items appear fun, exciting, and essential to a child's experience. By relying on these cheap, visually aggressive dyes, manufacturers can effectively camouflage the harsh reality of a product that is routinely high in refined sugar, fats, and salt, and devoid of actual, meaningful nutritional substance, successfully substituting cheap aesthetic appeal for dietary quality. This specific marketing tactic is viewed by countries with far stricter food safety laws, like Norway, as an unacceptable form of potentially harmful, misleading advertising that unethically targets and exploits the most vulnerable consumer demographic: young children. The profound invisible difference between the American and Norwegian Froot Loops is, at its most fundamental core, a reflection of two contrasting, deeply held societal values: the state's commitment to the precautionary principle versus the deeply ingrained national belief in unfettered economic liberty and minimal regulatory oversight. Norway consciously values the collective health and the absolute protection of its most vulnerable members above the mere cost and operational convenience of large-scale manufacturers and their chemical suppliers. The United States, conversely, has historically and consistently chosen to prioritize the freedom of the manufacturer to innovate, to market aggressively, and the presumed right of the consumer to choose, even if that choice is demonstrably uninformed and potentially harmful. This regulatory philosophy relies heavily on reactive warning labels and cumbersome post-market surveillance rather than proactive restriction at the source. The colorful cereal box, therefore, stands as a tangible and highly visible symbol of that deeply ingrained and ethically questionable compromise between commercial desire and public welfare. The American consumer is now forced, by the necessity of survival, to become their own personal diligent regulator, navigating the bright, deceptive, and chemically enhanced landscape of the breakfast aisle with a necessary self-taught skepticism, often observed only in Norwegian health ministries. The ultimate future of artificial colorants in food, symbolized so perfectly by the controversial red dye in Froot Loops, is likely to be one of prolonged and significant global divergence, at least for the immediate future. While the broader European Union has achieved a strong degree of standardization around the mandatory warning label requirement, the total uncompromising bans enforced by nations like Norway, Finland, and Iceland remain a powerful, ethical statement of principle to the rest of the world. They serve as a constant, unwavering, and crucial reminder that these specific synthetic, petroleum-derived additives are entirely superfluous to human nutrition, and that their continued inclusion in the food supply is purely and strictly for commercial, aesthetic gain, a short-term profit they have collectively deemed not worth the potential long-term risk to neurological health, gut function, and cellular integrity for their citizens.